Hey folks, my name is Joe McGlynn. Welcome to my shop. I want to tell you about my project. Behind me is a 1955 Studebaker pickup. The inspiration for this project is the original Rod and Custom Dream Truck. This is a custom vehicle that I have loved since I was a kid. I saw pictures of it in the little magazines and playing them at the swap meets. And as I was growing up when I was in high school, um, the story was that the truck had been wrecked and sold for parts and disappeared from sight. Sometime, I think in the 1980s, it was rediscovered, parts were rediscovered, and it was restored, and a gentleman in the St. Louis, Missouri area, Kurt McCormick, ended up owning that for a long period of time. I actually was able to visit Kurt, see the car, take pictures of it, and actually even drive the Dream Truck myself, which was so cool. What a thrill that was. So that's the inspiration. I'm not building a clone or a tribute, but you will be able to see some of the styling influences or cues that were in the original Dream Truck show up in this, starting with the chop and section. So the Dream Truck is very low. Um, uh, uh, the bodywork is low. The truck itself sits very low. So let's start there. And again, most of the work on this was done perhaps 20 years ago. A variety of things happened, and I was not able to make progress on the vehicle in the intermediate time. I did little bits here and there, built lots of other stuff along the way, but it's time to get back to this. So what's been done so far? 1955 Studebaker cab in front clip, the original Studebaker frame. So the top has been chopped 4 inches. I cut 4 inches through the A-pillars, through the top of the door frame, and 4 inches out from below the back window. That way the rear window stays the stock height, and I just cut from a flat band of sheet metal from right below the window. And that is what dictated how much chop I could actually do. Was the amount of material there that I could remove. The body was sectioned about 6 inches, so that's a horizontal slice right through the doors, fenders. So the whole body here is 6 inches shorter. The section is right through the middle or lower third of the cab and the doors. You can see traces of the seam here, and you can see on the back of the cab right below the gas cap filler where it hasn't been fully welded yet, right where that seam is. On the front clip, that section was split in 2 places. Part of it was taken through the fenders, and the balance of it was taken through the hood. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was to keep these things in proportion, and the other was if we took too much out of the fenders, there's no place for the tire and the wheel to go. And as it is, we'll see this later, it's already very tight clearance, and I had to get shorter front tires to even be able to put them on. And again, this is a long time ago when this was done. Back when I did the metal work on the cab, I also installed a Mustang 2 front suspension kit. This is something I got from Batman Fabrications, and it was an ultra low kit, so all of the mount points were moved up a bit to get the vehicle sitting even lower. And then on top of that, I put drop spindles in it. It will have airbags. Right now it has wood blocks to position everything about where it should be. I have a Cadillac V8, a 500 cubic inch mock-up engine, turbo 400 transmission in. We'll see more of that later. And when I originally built, did all of this work on the truck, I had installed a 4-link suspension kit and rear airbags, and I made those pieces. Truthfully, I was never really happy with that. I was not happy with the fabrication work I had done on the mounts. It was a little amateurish. And when I went to start thinking about what I want the bed to look like, I realized that the rear track, I had put an 8-inch Ford rear end in it that I sourced from a buddy of mine. It was too wide. The tires would stick out too far for the kind of bed that I wanted to put on it. And the only way, because of at the time I had the 4-link outside of the frame rails, the only way to move them in would be to remove factory cross members. And it took some head scratching to figure out how I wanted to package all that in. And that is actually where we want to start. So let me grab the camera and let's walk around and see what's there now and what's left to do. All right, so let's talk about the project from the backside here. First of all, looking at the cab, you can see first below here, there's the seam from the section. So it's only tack welded across the back of the cab. That all has to be carefully lined up, some more tacks put in, it has to be welded solid, and any warpage then smoothed out. Here's the seam from the top chop, and you can see it's right below the back window. Again, that all has to be little hammer and dolly work to tune up the seam, welded solid, and then a lot of work to smooth that out. I had some help, and we made a new top insert that's partially welded in at this point. That was a lot of work, a lot of careful work on the English wheel, back and forth, rolling, testing, working out the little kinks, getting all the contours to fit as good as possible. It came out pretty well, I think, though. But the place where my attention is right now is the rear suspension and the rear frame. So this is all recent work. If we rewind in time, this is what I started with maybe a month or so ago. This is the suspension as it was set up about 20 years ago. Now, of course, when I did it, it wasn't rusty like this that happened in the intervening couple of decades. But you can see that the brackets that I made back then, they're fairly simple, not particularly beautiful. The forelink is on the outside of the frame rails, and you can clearly see the factory cross member between the frame rails, behind the cab in front of the rear axle housing. So what I wanted to do is really kind of clean this up. In fact, you can see the original panhard bracket, or the first panhard bracket that I had made, to the right of the axle, and then a second one that is horizontal. And then from this view, you can see the factory cross member, and you can also see how I had the forelink attached to the outside of the frame rails here. Again, this is all functional. It probably would have worked, but the rear track was just too wide. It was too wide for the body that I wanted to do, and I just wasn't happy with the quality of the pieces that I had made back then. So what I did is I disassembled this. I took some measurements off of the frame rails, tried to figure out how much space I had to work with, and I brought that all into SolidWorks, and I drew up the rear kick-up and the rear frame rails, and then started going about designing pieces that would package together a little more neatly to make to move the suspension inboard first and foremost, and then just to try to incorporate as many brackets into simple single assemblies as I could. So this is what I was aiming for. I made a few small changes after this, but this is pretty close to final form. Of course, the rear axle here is a little wider than I ended up going with. But that was the plan from the original to the latter. And you can see I've replaced the truncated rear frame with something a little more, a little cleaner, a little smoother looking. So we can go back to the video and pick up the story here. When I put the truck together originally, I had made the kick-ups, but everything else was sort of kit and homebrew brackets that I wasn't really happy with. The forelinks were mounted outside of the frame rails because to put them between the frame rails would have required removing cross members and doing lots and lots of other stuff, boxing more of the inside frame. So flash forward, it's 2023, I was able to draw these pieces up in CAD, have them laser cut, and then fabricate all of this stuff and put it together. And I'm much happier with this. Starting at the front, I've got to replace the factory cross member that mounted the front of the bed. In fact, the factory cross member looked just like the rusty cross member you can see that mounts the cab. It was a duplicate of that, essentially. And it was located right where this new cross member is. I made the drive shaft hoop. That's a fabricated piece, and the bottom of that bolts on. You can see the two extensions for the socket head cap screws that just drops right out. I made the 4-link brackets with the Studebaker S in them, and I have mount tabs for the bed that I'm going to have to make. If we roll around and we look at the rest of this, I've narrowed the 8-inch Ford housing that I had in it originally, so I can tuck the tires in nice and tight. And I tried to package up all the bracketry as nicely and cleanly as I could. There's a few things that I'd probably do differently, but I didn't want just an assemblage of different brackets all cobbled together, which is what I had before. So I was able to incorporate the 4-link mounts on the axle and the airbag lower mounts and the lower shock mounts all into one piece. And then the upper airbag mounts include the, on one side, the panhard bar mount and the upper shock mounts. And we can roll around and look at this from another angle, and you can see how these pieces sort of fit together. The angle iron here is just for mock-up. That's stand-ins for the shock absorbers, just to hold everything in place while I fit it and tacked it in place. And I'm very close to just pulling those out, putting the airbags in, and setting this guy on the ground and seeing everything work and hopefully all work smoothly. Just for fun, I made a back brace for the 8-inch Ford housing and welded that in that says Studebaker. I don't plan to run a lot of horsepower in this or race it or really have any need for a back brace on the housing, but it made me happy. I like it. I think it's cool. I'm not sure anybody other than people watching this video will see it, but that's okay. Now, where are we at on this? So I have a rear anti-sway bar. This is a splined sway bar setup, and those arms are connected welded to Borgenson splined couplings right there. Problem is, and this was the problem with the original setup, the whole motivation for this was the original suspension that I had set up had the tires way too far out. They had to be far enough out to clear the 4-link suspension that ran on the outside of the frame rails. So packaging everything up and moving inside the frame rails allowed me to narrow the rear end housing. These are Torino late model Ford rear end housings on a Ford 8-inch center section. So I cut a good probably 8 inches out of each side of this and centered up the pumpkin. These arms are laser cut out of 3/8 inch steel. And the problem that I discovered when I started putting this together is the backing plate for the brakes, I'm running drum brakes, goes here, and it does not clear the end of this sway bar arm. So there's probably a lot of ways this could be solved. What I'm going to do is remake this arm. Instead of this being solid, I'm going to have a hole here so that it can slide over the spline coupling and weld on this inside edge. That'll give me a good 3/4 of an inch plus of additional clearance. So that should be great. That should give me enough clearance out here for the brake backing plates. So we're going to go ahead and make these. Once that's taken care of, I can weld some tabs on the axle housing to connect the linkage for the sway bar mounts. I can fit axles, put the backing plates on, put the tires and wheels back on, and set this guy on the ground and see what we've got. So let's get on that. Okay, new arms for the anti-sway bar on the back of the truck. I had these plasma cut, CNC plasma cut by an outside company. How convenient is that? When I first put this truck together, that wasn't even a thing. So everything was drill press, bandsaw, belt sander. These still need some cleanup though. So very clean edge, especially for a plasma cut, but they're not beautiful yet. They're just a plasma cut piece. So here's what we need to do. It's a 3/8 inch bolt here for the link that will connect to the rear end. So the plasma cut hole, pretty good accuracy actually. It's just a little tight and there's a little bit of dross in the hole. So I want to drill these holes out to clearance them and chamfer the 2 edges just to lightly break them. And then I'm going to bead blast these. I'm going to lightly sand off the plasma cut marks. I'm going to take any burrs off from the holes, and I'm going to try to round over all these edges around all the holes and around the outer perimeter to soften up the look of this and sand it and see if we can make it really nice. So let's head over to the drill press. We'll drill these holes and chamfer the edges. I'll bead blast them, belt sand the edges, and then I've got some new tools to try out to break the edges on all those outside parts. So let's get to it. Okay, so I cleansed, drilled the hole, put a small chamfer there with a countersink. A 3/8 inch bolt fits just fine now. It was just removing a little bit of dross in the hole. The hole was actually accurately sized. There was just a little bit of flash from the plasma cutter. I belt sanded the edge just to remove track marks from the plasma cutting. And then I bead blasted the parts to remove the mill scale. So step one is done. The next step is to make these look a little pretty. So I've got a couple of tools that I'm going to use to do that. The new tool that I'm looking forward to trying out is a little pneumatic deburring tool. These are available on Amazon. It was fairly inexpensive, $50, I think. This particular one comes with, I don't know if you can see that, but they have small carbide inserts like you might have in a milling cutter. And these have a small radius in them. I've never used this, but my hope is that I can use these and trace around the parts and get a nice rounded over edge all the way around the part. So before I do it on these, I'll get a piece of scrap metal, give it a shot. If it looks like it's going to work okay, I will go ahead and round over the outside edges of the part. And I'd also like to go around these 4 lightning holes to also give them sort of a smooth, rounded over edge. I think that would look nice. So sample part first, and then if that works okay, we'll try it on the actual parts. Okay, let's talk about that. I have to say, I like the idea, not a great quality tool. I have 2 of these, about 49 bucks a piece. First one imploded. The bearing broke off, which caused me to gouge up the piece, and then the tool seized up. It seems to have loosened up now. So I don't know if there's something loose in here or if I got a piece of grit, but it wouldn't work at all. So I changed the parts over to the other one, and I was able to get it finished. Looks like I need a little bit more to blend here. I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on with the rest of the finishing. Here I'm using a die grinder with a flap disc just to clean up the large hole where the splined coupling goes. And I'm changing over to another die grinder that uses cartridge rolls. These are super handy for getting into small places. Just knocking any little burrs or imperfections off the inside, nothing extensive. Change over to a little bit smaller roll, get the last hole. Other one. Those are pretty good. I'm going to go back to the flap wheel and just clean up a few marks around the outside. I still have that scar from where the tool broke. We'll come back to that. I'm using a small DA, starting with 100 grit sandpaper on a 3-inch DA, and just kind of gently going over all the outside, cleaning it up. What I'm trying to do is just remove any little texture or imperfections or anything that might catch your eye. These sanding discs that I'm using, I'm not sure what the composition of the grit is, but they don't hold up very long sanding on metal. But they do a nice enough job. You can see that I change the discs fairly often. So I probably went through 15 discs in the course of sanding this. Once I use up my stock, I'll probably want to find some discs that have a little more lifespan than these. But I've used these for a long time on a lot of different projects. Here I'm changing over to 200 grit discs, 220 I think actually, and just removing the 100 grit scratches and trying to smooth everything up. Just want these parts to look nice and nice soft contours, nice even finish. Once these are done and welded and have the final cleanup, they'll be ready for primer and paint or whatever we decide to do later. All right, I'm pretty happy with how these arms have cleaned up. It's disappointing that I have a scar on this one from where the tool broke, the little guide bearing shot off. So mixed review on that. When it works, it's nice. It gives a nice controlled radius. It's way easier than chasing it around with a file or a belt sander. But when it screws up, it's a problem. So mixed reviews, $49. Might need to look for a little higher quality tool. All right, so I have sway bar links all cleaned up. I cleaned up the spline couplers, and I've got it mocked up now back on the truck. And you can see how I've moved the sway bar arm in, and I should have some nice clearance now for when I put the backing plate on. I put the couplers on so the set screws are both clocked in the same position on the ends of the sway bar itself, and I have the arms rotated around sitting on the rear axle housing, so they are both going to be clocked in the same position once I tack weld them. So my plan is to put 2 small tack welds on each of these, maybe 3, but no more than that. A couple of reasons. One, it's easier for me to do a good weld sitting at the bench than out of position here on the truck. But also the bushing that the rear sway bar sits in is plastic. If I put too much heat into this, it will cook that plastic bushing and we'll have a mess. So don't want that. So one little tack weld, I'll probably jump over to the other side, put one tack weld on that, bounce back and forth, just so that I don't put too much heat into it at any one point in time. So let's get on that. All right, earlier I was using that pneumatic chamfer tool with a roundover bit to kind of ease the edges of these arms and around the holes, and I like the look of that a lot. Unfortunately, the bearing broke off in the middle of using it, and on one of the arms I get an unfortunate gouge. I don't know how well that will show up on the video, but when I look at it, it's pretty noticeable. It's pretty ugly. It won't be terribly visible on the car, but that kind of stuff sticks in my mind, and I'm not happy about it. And I thought about it, and I think I can put a small weld bead over the marks, sand them back, and then round the edge over and blend that in and make it look a little better. So I'm going to turn on the welder, lay a small weld on that. I will grind to this face and smooth it out, and then I will round it over again and see if we can't make some of that ugly disappear. All right, let's get to it. I think that's going to work out just fine. I used a 1/16 inch filler rod, and I was careful not to put too much heat into the part because I want the bead built up on the surface and not looking for a lot of penetration. So I will go to the belt sander and I will sand this face down, and I will sand this face down, and we'll go back through the same cleanup process we were doing originally and see if we can make this a little prettier and be rid of that little scar. Okay, that's already better. Weld bead's ground down. So the gouge is gone. Now I'm just going to put the radius back in that and do a final cleanup sand, and this should be ready to go. Okay, so I've got the arms finished. I sanded everything out again with 220, and let's see, I believe, can't actually tell, I believe this is the one, yeah, this is the one that had the badly chewed up edge from the roundover bit, and it looks pretty good. Maybe not microscopically perfect, but I'm happy with it. So I have two arms, nice and tight, TIG welded on both sides, spline couplings are in, cleaned up, sanded smooth, ready to go back on the truck, and we can start thinking about putting axles in and brakes and tires and wheels and set that thing back down on the ground and see how it looks.
Okay, so that's a wrap on the sway bar arms. I think they look great. Turns out there's plenty of room for the set screw and lock nut to hold them in place on the splined ends. Tabs are welded on, arms are welded up. Everything fits, plenty of clearance for the brakes, for the frame rails. I'm very happy. I know this was a longish video just to make a pair of sway bar ends, but there was some story to tell about what's going on with the project and where we're picking up the narrative. So I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe and check out other videos. Next up, we'll be putting the axles together, setting the bearing races in the housing, putting the tires and wheels and brakes on, and setting this back down on the ground so we can take a gander at how it sits. Hope to see you soon.